In this Chapter 2 video for Principles of Food and Beverage Cost Control, we're going to discuss budgeting. The main topics we're going to discuss are the purpose of budgets and why we forecast, the different methods that we use to forecast our volume, as well as different types of budgets that we can use in the operation. So first, the budget is important as well as forecast because it essentially gives us a plan. Okay? It also kind of can be considered a roadmap. Our budget kind of tells us what we are allowed to spend as far as our expenses. It also tells us how much we should be bringing in for sales so that we can compare that. Now, an advantage of budget is that it is a plan, it is a roadmap, it gives us kind of some guidance. One of the disadvantages of budgets is that they are very time consuming to create. They're very time consuming to follow up on, but it is still very important. If you are working in an operation like, let's say, a hotel or in a restaurant that has multiple outlets, trying to get everyone's budgets together to create an overall big budget can be very challenging. And so that's one of the disadvantages. Another disadvantage of the budget is this phrase that a lot of people may or may not be familiar with, spend it or lose it. Spend it or lose it. This leads to unnecessary spending, okay? This leads to a lot of excessive spending that might be unnecessary. Because what this concept says is that if I don't spend it now, the next time they do my budget, they're going to realize I didn't have as much of a cost and they're going to decrease my spending budget. And so that leads to a lot of excessive purchases. And so we want to make sure that that's not going to happen in that budgeting process. So our forecasting process is essentially a prediction. So just like the weather, somebody is going to look at the conditions in the atmosphere, and they are going to say, the last time the conditions were like this was the result. We had rain. And so the same thing happens in our restaurants. We can forecast, we can anticipate what's going to happen and make an educated guess. Okay, and so forecasting our customer counts. In this particular example, we are looking at our count for the previous year, and we want to see potentially a decrease in the reason why we have less customers. And so you want to look as a manager, as you're creating the budget, about the things that are happening around you. If, let's say, there was a major event like the Final Four in San Antonio in 2018, when we're preparing our 2019 budget, we want to account for the fact that Final Four is not going to be here in April. And so with that being said, we would then go ahead and plan for a decrease. Now, how do we get to this number of 31,008 customers? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. Math is the way we get there. So let's talk about this. We take our 32,300 customers, our guests, and we multiply by 0.04. When I'm going to multiply, I'm going to take this 4%, move my decimal place over, and drop the percent sign. Okay? And so 4% of 32,300 is 1,292. Oops, not a dollar sign. Guests. Now, because we are decreasing in our count, we're going to subtract that from our original number. So 32,000 guessed 300 minus 1,292 gives us our new total of 31,008 guests. That is forecasting to figure out how many guests we are going to be serving for that particular year. All right, so let's talk about forecasting our revenue. So when we forecast our revenue, typically we increase by a percentage. Or we'll decrease by a percentage. And so our growth for our revenue could be, let's say in this case, 3% is our growth, okay? Now, if we take into account inflation, which is just the thought that things are just going to naturally get more expensive as we move on. So, you know, things like a pack of gum used to cost 5 cents and now it's, you know, $1 something. That's inflation. And so if we take into account the inflation of 2.5%, then our real growth, our actual growth would actually be 0.5%. And so that's what we can use to create our budgets. And so that way we're thinking about our budgets in a smart and wise way. If we don't take into account inflation, then we could be overselling our budget. So we have two different types of budgets. We have long-term and short-term. The long-term budgets typically involve the top managers, the GMs, maybe the AGM, executive chef. They may be involved with setting those particular type of budgets. The capital expenditure budget is when we're going to purchase a large piece of equipment or make a large investment, okay? And so, you know, our capital expenditure budget might allow for us to purchase a new dishwasher or a new oven, or maybe replace all of the chairs and tables in the front of the house. So that's our capital expenditure budget. Our operating budget is setting, you know, the labor, setting the food cost based on the volume of business that's anticipated and forecasted. The short-term budget is going to include all managers. And so you may have heard your manager say they're out of their labor budget. They have no more money in their labor budget, so they can't schedule a lot of people. They have to schedule just the bare minimum. Those short-term budgets are part of that larger operating budget, that long-term operating budget, but they're broken down into different segments: weekly, monthly, quarterly. You know, sometimes some months are going to be busier than others, and so we want to make sure that we're allocating and we're dividing that operating budget over the whole year into smaller parts, like by the month and by the week. We also have fixed and flexible budgets. So fixed, they're not going to change, just like our costs that we talked about before. Fixed budgets are solid. Flexible budgets can change based on the volume of business. So if we are really busy and we have to spend more money on labor and food ingredients to produce the food, then we also need to make sure that our sales are higher than what we anticipated the sales to be. So it's okay to go over budget on our expenses if the sales also go over budget so that they justify why we spent more money.